Hey guys, welcome back to Coliseum Forum. I'm joined today with one of my all-time favorite comics people. This is Aubrey Sitterson, writer of No One Left to Fight, comic book story of professional wrestling. Did I say that right? It's a long title.
Yeah, man, you got it.
Okay,
You
good,
got
good,
it
yeah.
close enough. It's fine.
If you are binge watching Netflix at this point, you may have stumbled across the Toys That Made Us, and he did a feature on the wrestling episode, which was super cool to see pop up in there. Um, why don't we start there? How did that happen? Like, how were they just like, hey, we need a wrestling expert, and this guy knows like he knows what he's talking
Dude,
about.
dude, that's entirely it. Nick Farrell, who is a producer on the show, reached out to me via Twitter. Or no, you know what? Maybe. I don't remember exactly. Now I'm just making stuff up. Nick Farrell was kind of like the source point for it, right? And he followed me on Twitter at least. And so he knew who I was. I think he'd read the book and dug it. And, they film in LA and they needed somebody to come in and kind of provide the connective tissue.
Right.
So if you've seen the episode, and I told them immediately when they called or they emailed me about it, I said, listen, first of all, yes, I'd love to.
Right.
As evidenced by me being here today, I take any opportunity to get on camera and
Right.
shill.
Sure.
It's part of my personal brand.
Yeah.
I was like, listen, as much as I'd love to, I don't really know toys. Like I'm just not like a toy guy, really. Like
Right.
I had toys as a kid, but
Sure.
like, I'm not a toy guy with like capital TG. And he said that's absolutely fine because we've got that covered. We've got plenty of toy dudes coming
Right.
on here to talk about wrestling toys. What we need is somebody who can provide like the historical context and
Sure.
tell us about the industry and the art form and like the medium of wrestling and how it evolved. And so I said, great. Send me a list of like questions or topics because I want to be prepared, right? Because I wrote the comic book story of professional wrestling, and it's massive. If you haven't read it, it's
a thick one. It looks
like,
great on a shelf.
Thank you. Chris Moreno, my co-creator on it, we put a ton of work into it, and it goes from like there's cavemen wrestling in it, right? But like it starts in earnest in like the 1880s.
Right.
It goes all the way up to as recent as we could get it, which is about like 2016.
Right.
And individual chapters on wrestling in the UK, Mexico, and Japan. It is an exorbitant amount of information. I tell people it was both exhaustingly and exhaustively researched.
Right.
And after I did it, I promptly forgot like every single date. Like I just had to like wipe my brain clean.
Right.
So I made myself like this big cheat sheet of all of like the actual like specific dates and locations and stuff like that. Because I remember the big arcs, but I don't remember dates very well. So I went there with like my stack of papers, man, and I was there for like 3 or 4 hours. And they just grilled me about wrestling history and how companies changed hands and Monday Night Wars and Ted Turner getting involved and, even further back, and one of the things we talk about a lot in the book is this like mistaken idea that wrestling it's only recently been revealed that wrestling isn't completely on the up and up.
Right.
It's like there were exposés in major newspapers going back to like the 1930s.
Right.
So, that was something we talked about too a lot. And yeah, man, it was super fun because I love talking about this stuff. And I was really fortunate and delighted that they used me a bunch.
Yeah. Right.
I am all over it just to provide that connective tissue. And B, that they didn't make me look like a total goofball. So I was
right.
I was really happy with how that turned out.
Right. So just so you're aware, we do have Facebook engagement while we do this. Somebody has already commented on what a wonderful hair day you're having.
Thank you.
David
Thank you.
Hood.
I wish we had like the functionality to keep like a running tally on screen.
Just
but
ding.
We'll just announce them as they happen, right? That's one. We're at 1 so far. Let's see if we can get those numbers up a little bit.
And then there's one more thing that I've been asked about with the other ones we've done. So I'm just going to use it to address. I'm going to address it now. So the way our studio is set up, I am looking at you. So people have asked, why does it look like I'm always like looking away from who I'm interviewing? For me, I am looking at you on the screen, right? But
it's because my inner radiance.
That's exactly
it's like
the Emperor of Mankind in 40K. You can't ever look him in the face.
Yeah, you need some of the special glasses in order to do it.
Yeah. So that's what it is. I'm looking at Aubrey. I could do this for an hour, but that would be weird and it doesn't work for me. So, so back to the Toys That Made Us and then wrestling. I mean, I would assume that they found out about you because of the comic book story of professional wrestling, right? Like,
I think so. I think that's probably it. Yeah. I mean, like it might have been like a straight shoot thing
Sure.
because, one of the things that led to the comic book story of professional wrestling, and that led my editor on that book, Patrick Barb, to reach out to me, was I had like for 4 years, I think, I did a weekly, at least weekly wrestling podcast called Straight Shoot. So it might have been because of that, but I know the comic book story of professional wrestling was definitely a part of it because it had just come out, I think.
Right. So when I think of Aubrey Sitterson, I think of comic books and I think of wrestling, right? I think those two things are kind of intertwined with the Aubrey brand at this point.
Sure.
What of those passions started first for you? Was it wrestling or was it comics?
Comics. Absolutely. For sure. Comics. Yeah. Early on it was newspaper strips for me. I didn't get super, like, I was always into the aesthetic and the characters of comics, but I didn't live near a comic book shop.
Sure.
This is a little bit before digital comics were available.
Right.
So I didn't really have the access to comics. My cousins loved them and had like a basement full of them that I would, indulge in when I was over there, but I didn't have ready access to monthly comic books. So my hit were the newspapers, man, were the funny pages in the newspapers. We moved a lot when I was a kid, and my grandfather used to, and I don't know, this is showing how old I am, but in the old days when there were newspaper comics, different newspapers would choose to have different comic strips on the pages. And so my grandfather in Richmond, Virginia, as we kind of like bounced around places, he would clip out the funnies from the Richmond Times-Dispatch and like send me care packages of all these newspaper clippings of all the comic book, comic strips that I didn't get to read. Yeah, It was cool. So that was like that was the first hit. That was like the first comics love. I didn't really fall down the rabbit hole of like broader comics, right? In terms of like comic books and graphic novels, and because it's all the same medium, but it's just different delivery methods.
So it's sequential art, right?
Yeah, it's all comics, and I didn't fall down the rabbit hole of that until I was in college when I moved to New York. And moving to New York City, it was eye-opening in a lot of ways. Certainly not.
Where did you live in New York?
Say again?
Where did you live in New York?
A lot of places. So like when I was in college, I mostly lived in like lower Manhattan. And then after I graduated, I moved out to Queens and Astoria.
Oh, cool. I lived in Jamaica for a long time. So.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
So kind of neighbors. So
we, one of the big changes and one of the awesome things for me moving to New York was there were seemingly like a comic book shop like every 3 or 4 blocks.
Yeah,
like,
for sure.
So many of them in New York. It's bananas. And so just having that proximity and that kind of access made it really easy for me to kind of fill in like the huge gaps in my knowledge. And, and I kind of discovered, oh wow, this is even better than I thought it was. Yeah. This is a broader and wider and deeper medium and discipline than I really had any idea. And, so comics came first, and then wrestling similarly. I because of my age, I got to benefit from both like the 80s boom period, right? Like the tail end of like I wasn't old enough to remember like the start of Hulkamania, right? But like I got to benefit from that 80s golden age boom, like the tail end of it, as well as the 90s Monday Night Wars Attitude Era stuff. Like that was when I was in high school, and it was inescapable. Right. Like you couldn't walk down the hallways without seeing. And I grew up in the South too. I'm from Richmond, Virginia, and so which is very much Flair country, in case you're not aware. But like you couldn't walk down the hallways without seeing dudes doing Too Sweet like Wolfpack at each other, or like yelling out rock catchphrases, or like it was saturated. It was everywhere. And so, I wasn't the hardest core wrestling fan just because I I don't have a lot of discipline in my media consumption. I get really into, most of the time I get really in, or, that's not entirely accurate. So my big hurdle to being a wrestling fan in the 90s, and like prior to like kind of the present day, was just the consistency of it, and just like no DVR, just having to be there at the same place,
right,
watching the stuff, right. So until I was an adult and could like actually like organize my life in such a way that I could do that consistently, it was really just kind of a background element, and it was a thing I liked, and I knew the wrestlers and kind of broad strokes, but I wasn't a diehard fan. that changed when I was working at Marvel. I was an editor right after I graduated college. I became an editor at Marvel, and I realized really quickly that it wasn't sustainable for me to spend all day making comics, go out to a bar and talk about comics with other people who make comics,
right,
and then go home and read comics.
Sure.
Like that wasn't going to be. I was going to end up hating comics. I realized really quickly if I continue doing that. So I needed another outlet, right? And I think that's really important for anybody. It's an important realization for when you're, because like as blessed an event as it is for your hobby to become your career,
right?
As amazing as that is, and it's a privilege, really, you know. You need that separation, and you need other things to be passionate about. So I was flipping through the channels one night, and I stumbled across. I remember it really vividly. It must have been on like Heat, I think, Heat or Velocity. I don't know.
Okay.
I would have. So I guess I don't remember it that vivid. I told you I'm not great with specifics, but I remember I seared into my memory. It was Eddie Guerrero and Batista, and they were like building to like a feud between the two.
Right.
It was this goofy backstage vignette with a proctologist, and like Eddie Guerrero had like was trying to get Batista a proctology exam, and Batista had like turned it around on him. So now like Eddie Guerrero was going to have to get this proctology exam. And it was the goofiest, campiest, most ridiculous thing. And it really, I don't know, it scratched my itches in a way, man. And I really quickly realized, oh, wow, you know, so much of what I like about serialized superhero comics also exists in professional wrestling. And so that was me falling down that rabbit hole, which, you know, was realizing how similar it was to comics and being like, wow, I can get the same hit that I love from comic books, but get it from something else. So I have some separation between the two. And that was the start. But like one of the things that like I harp on a lot when people ask me, and I probably to an insufferable degree, is that wrestling's different. You know, wrestling is not superhero comics. It's serialized, and there's a lot of similarities in terms of morality plays and, you know, the use of nostalgia and things like that. But it operates on a very different level, and learning that only kind of made me more enamored of wrestling because of how unique a thing it is.
Sure.
I was kind of a late bloomer in both regards, man. Like I feel kind of like sometimes I feel self-conscious about it because people talk about like, oh yeah, you know, I was 5 years old and I saw my first Spider-Man comic and I knew that this is what I wanted to do for a living. And
for sure, right? But no, I mean,
longer, man.
Comics are for everybody, right? Like at the end of the day, like
I think so.
What we do, like everybody's included. So no, I you know, if somebody just finding comics at 36 years old, like please come read comics. If you have questions, like we will answer your questions because we want you to be into the thing we're into, right? So I do have two more questions from people watching. One, somebody asked, how much conditioner do you go through?
Oh, a lot, a ton. Yeah. I alternate too. I always use Shea Moisture. That's the brand I like.
Yeah.
But there's two different. There's a Curl and Shine, which I just switched to now, and then there's like a black Jamaican castor oil that I just finished that. And so I switch back and forth because I feel like it does a little bit different things to my hair.
Sure.
Hop back and forth.
And then the other question is, you can pick a wrestler from any era, but only one. Who's your favorite?
Oh man. It changes. It changes day to day, right? I've got like a top 5, but they all kind of shift around.
Sure.
Right now, Flair. Honestly, and maybe it's just because I mentioned Flair country earlier, but Ric Flair.
No, I mean Ric Flair. Like, I don't know if there's been a day in my life, in my adult life, that I haven't Ric Flair wooed like at least once.
You need to.
I like to do
it first. I like to do it first thing in the morning.
That's
just sit bolt upright with a woo to start my day.
Right. Okay. So we kind of touched on this a little bit ago. You know, when you were talking about exhaustively and exhaustively researching the comic book story of professional wrestling, what were you doing when did you sit up and, you know, bolt right in bed and do the woo and you're like, I'm writing that comic? Or like, what was the genesis of the idea that would become that book? Because it's a tome, it's a big boy.
Yeah, man. My editor Patrick Barb formerly of 10 Speed, which is a publisher, they're part of Penguin Random House,
right?
He was a Straight Shoot fan. He listened to my podcast. Yeah. And so 10 Speed does this line of books. They're called The Comic Book Story of blank. And when he reached out to me, they had done Beer. and they had video games in the works. I think since then they've done baseball, maybe something else too. I don't want to spoil anything if it hasn't come out yet. No, you know what? I don't want to risk it.
Okay.
But yeah, it's a line of books, and Patrick's a huge wrestling fan. We actually hung out at multiple New Japan shows in the United
cool.
States.
Very cool.
Me and Patrick, yeah, he's the real deal. He had been pushing for a wrestling book, right? And he finally got permission. And like, as you know, as a lot of wrestling fans know, there's generally some reluctance and pushback on doing wrestling stuff, because there is this long held perception that it's for like mouth breathing idiots who don't have money to spend on stuff. And hopefully now that that myth has been evaporated, right? Because wrestling is massively popular. Yeah, he got permission to do it, and he got the sign off to do it, and he reached out to me, which I was really thrilled about, because I mean, you know, I don't think it was a out of left field decision that if you're going to do a wrestling comic book, reach out to the comic book writer who has a wrestling podcast. But I was really happy he did, and you know, he reached out to me, and you know, at first I was kind of taken aback because I never really thought too terribly much about doing nonfiction comics, right? And specifically, I'm not a fan of most nonfiction comics, like as a genre. I think they're really hard to do well.
Agreed. There are some gems in that genre, but by and large, I agree with you. Like they're hard to read. They're
common.
hard to.
They do well. People buy them and they like to have them. But for my money, most of the time, you know, a nonfiction comic, it falls into one of a few pitfalls, right? One is that it's just anecdote, as opposed to a story, right? It's just a list of things that happen,
right?
And that's not enough for me. If I want that, I'll go to Wikipedia, right? Like I can get that somewhere else. If I'm going to read a nonfiction thing, and this isn't just for comics, it's for documentaries, it's for nonfiction books. I want you to curate it and present it to me in a way that not only communicates facts, but also gives me a point of view and a narrative thread, right? Like I think that's crucial. And I think that's rare because it's extraordinarily difficult. So that's one. And then another thing was that a lot of times I read nonfiction comics, and again, it's kind of like the Wikipedia-ization of things. And that, like, I don't know why it's a comic, right? Like, this isn't to say that like comics can only do certain things, that comics are limited and you shouldn't cover certain topics with comics. It's to say that comics is its own unique, wonderful medium. It has its own strengths and weaknesses like every other medium. And if you're going to use comics to tell a story, there needs to be a reason that you're using comics, not just because that's the medium that you work in and you like comics, but there needs to be a reason why you're covering this nonfiction topic with this specific medium. Especially since, you know, like one of the limitations of comics generally is that it is information. It has a lower information density than prose. That's not a knock on comics, but a page of comics doesn't have as many words as a page of prose does.
Absolutely. So that's absolutely true.
If you're looking to impart facts and information, prose is generally going to be your best bet, right? And so you need to find another reason to use this specific medium. And so I was very nervous about it. And I had never really I didn't sit around, you know, the type of comics I sat around dreaming of doing are No One Left to Fight, right? Big action-based fiction stuff that uses kind of like generally perceived of as trashy genres to explore bigger ideas and to do them artfully. And like that's always been my dream and my goal. And, you know, doing nonfiction wrestling comics didn't really fit into that. However, I knew that if that book got announced and anyone else was writing it, I would be furious. I would be livid. So I knew that I had to do it out of spite, if for no other reason. And also just I wanted to make sure it was done right, man. Like I knew that like this is kind of a one-shot deal, right? Penguin Random House, this massive international publisher, wasn't going to be doing multiple wrestling books. This was it. And and I knew that nothing like this existed, right? They're in not just in comics, but in prose even, right? There is not a comprehensive history of professional wrestling, right? On a global level, like covering everything. Am I breaking up?
No.
Okay.
I think, yeah, you're good. It's Zoom. So if you're watching at home, if you're curious how we've been doing this, we're broadcasting in a Zoom meeting out to OBS and then to Facebook Live. So there's a lot of moving pieces, and sometimes they're just like, we don't feel like doing that today.
I just want to make sure it was. I saw it flickering. I just want to make sure it wasn't me. Where was I? Yeah. So I knew that we had to get it right, and so that was a big part of the work, man. The heavy lift of it was figuring out what the approach was, figuring out what the story was going to be, figuring out, why it needed to be comics and what we were going to use about comics to make this unique and better than if it was in any other medium. Right. And fortunately I had my co-creator Chris Moreno with me, who I'd worked with previously on Worth, which is it's not many people know about it. Look it up. You can Google it, Worth. But that was our first book together, and I knew that I brought Chris on board because I knew that this was the project for him. Not only is he a wrestling fan, he gets the material, but that guy is amazing at two things I knew we were going to be leaning on a lot, which is period stuff, right? And because it's a history, we're going to cover a lot of different eras, and caricature,
right?
Chris is a brilliant cartoonist, and he is able to make comic book drawings look like people without falling into the light box photo tracing trap that a lot of people do.
And, a lot of times in that book, just from my perspective, you guys are imitating like movement, right? Because it's wrestling. And he really expressed that in that book. I think it's one of the good things when you look at it, you're like, oh yeah, that guy's getting a suplex, right? Like that's what's happening there.
He's a brilliant cartoonist. He's a true cartoonist. And man, I can't talk about it yet, but our next thing is going to be, it's bonkers. It is the next thing we're doing. It plays to all of our strengths. And because I've been working together on 2 books now, which were very much like Worth was something that came from the Roddenberry guys, and they said, here's an idea for this thing. We want y'all to do it. And then we did. Comic book story, professional wrestling. We had freedom on it, but we had a very specific list of criteria that we knew that we needed to hit, right? In order to make this thing work as it was supposed to. So, Chris's involvement made this book because, what we realized early on was like, listen, what's going to make this work as a comic is that we use, wrestling is a visual medium, right? Like a huge part of wrestling is seeing what these men and women look like, right? How they do their moves, what they're wearing, like even just like the colors of their hair and stuff, like just all these kinds of specifics. And that's something that a prose history of wrestling cannot do.
Right.
Even copious illustrations, it's not the same as the juxtaposition of text and images. So like that was a thing that Chris and I talked about a lot as we were both getting going on it and throughout the entire process.
So how long do you think because that book, and I'll attest to this, is extremely well researched and kind of put together. How long just on your end did it take to get the research done, just to even start writing the story?
Well, it's hard to say, man, because so much, I was fortunate that I knew enough to know what I didn't know.
Sure.
Right. So like the beginning of my process, I sat down, I knew how many pages we had, and I did page breakdowns. And I said, here's what's going to go on every single page. And I didn't do panel by panel, but I said, this is the page where we're going to talk about the 4 pillars. And this is the page where we're going to talk about the Guerrero family and, whatever. Like, I went through and did that. And that gave me a really clear idea of the gaps in my knowledge and what I needed to go research more about and, to figure out the connective tissue and just simple facts and questions about stuff I didn't know. So, like a lot of the stuff I knew already just from having been a wrestling nerd and having read a bunch of stuff and watched a bunch of documentaries and done so many years of straight shoot, right? And just like associated research and talking to people and things like that. So, it's tough to say, like, comprehensively, like how much research went into it because so much of it was done before the project even existed.
Right.
But yeah, man, it took, I tell the story a lot, but like at the time I was writing G.I. Joe. And so I had a really clear idea, or I thought I did, of how long it takes me to write 20 pages of a comic. Right. Because I did it monthly for G.I. Joe. And so I was like, okay, well, I know how long I need to do these things and I'll pad it a little bit because it's a new project and stuff like that. And I got 2 pages into maybe like a page and a half into I made a schedule for myself and everything. I got a page and a half into comic book story professional wrestling. And I looked at my watch and how much time I'd spent on it. And I said, oh no, this is a way bigger, like, writing a nonfiction comic with so many dates and so many specifics and needing to pull so much visual reference just to make sure people's outfits and ring attire were correct.
Right.
Like that's such a much huger. I'm a writer. It is a exponentially larger. How about that? An exponentially larger, more difficult task than writing like laser gun fights against against monsters for GI Joe, right? And that's not to denigrate the work I did on GI Joe, but it just simply wasn't as time consuming as writing comic book story professional wrestling. So yeah, man, the time involved ballooned because every single time you see a date or any kind of like concrete fact, I had to double check that stuff, man.
Right.
Because I knew that I'm a wrestling fan. I've spent enough time around wrestling fans to know how, like, you think comic book fans are nuts about continuity.
Okay.
Brother, you have no idea. You have no idea about the wrestling fans who will let you know if, the boots are the slightly wrong shade of green for that wrestler in that match, on that tour.
We have there is this segment of comic book fans and wrestling fans that kind of cross over, and so we run into those guys, and I have friends like that, and yeah, I've been in some of those conversations where they are very, very into the continuity, and like you pointed out, like, oh, the color of that the shade of that green, that's a little off, right? So
yeah, so we had to get it right, man, and that required a lot of work, like just throughout the process, just to double check and triple check.
Right. So we have a couple of other questions. Somebody wanted to know. And I don't know if you're keeping up current with what, wrestling history or what's happening in the news. But there's a rumor that Vince might end house shows and go just specifically to TV. What do you think of that?
I don't know. I mean, house shows are pretty much ended right now anyways, as far as I know. So I feel like that decision's probably already been made for him.
Sure.
If and when things get back to normal, I would be shocked if they made that decision. Having worked I worked at WWE as well. After I worked at Marvel, I went to WWE, and I know firsthand that house shows are kind of the bedrock of that company, right? That's how they make. They sign huge TV deals and toy and video game licensing deals and stuff like that. But the way they make their nut week to week is by touring all over the country.
Sure.
It's. I'm trying to think of a good analogy, but it might not be the most lucrative part of their business. You know what? Here's a comic book analogy for you. The same way that, if you look at Marvel and where Marvel gets their money, right? Where Marvel gets their money is licensing deals and film and television.
Absolutely.
Right? Publishing exists, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to all these other revenue streams. However, the reason I think that, it's the same reason I think that rumors about Marvel stopping publishing comics are overblown, is that is consistent month after month revenue. Right. And WWE house shows are kind of the same way.
Sure.
That's revenue that doesn't go anywhere. WrestleMania revenue, that's seasonal. Television revenue is based on a lot of complicated factors that are outside of their control.
Right.
But they know that every single week they can have touring production, multiple touring productions, 3 if you count NXT, bouncing around places, packing houses full of people.
Right. Not so much a question, but somebody definitely wanted to let you know that you are a master of teasing your future projects, and they adore you for it.
There it is.
So, speaking of, this is a question, and if you can't talk about it, that's fine. Are we ever going to see a sequel to No One Left to Fight?
I certainly hope so, man. There's a big old #1 on the spine, which kind of implies the existence of future volumes, right? And if you've read No One Left to Fight, you know that it ends in a place where we're aching to tell more of these things. Comics are complicated. Comics publishing is complicated, never more so than right now.
Absolutely.
Due to factors I'm sure everybody's aware of. Fico and I are ready. We came up with No One Left to Fight. It came very much out of our love for Dragon Ball, and specifically Dragon Ball Z, which was where I first fell in love with Dragon Ball as a whole. And one of the things I loved about Dragon Ball Z is that not only does it start and it's clear that there's this whole broad, wider world in which these characters have interacted and had adventures and stories and fought and loved and done all these different things. Like, not only that, but there's this huge future, and it's a generational story where it's not just about Goku as a kid. It's about Goku as an adult. It's about Goku's sons. It's about Vegeta's marriage and his son. And, that is, we made No One Left to Fight came from a place of Fico and me saying, look, here's all the things that we love about Dragon Ball. Right. How do we do this our way? Right. How do we do this with, an American comics approach?
It feels like a love letter, but not derivative, if that makes sense.
Thank you. That was really the intent, and high up on our list of things that we love about Dragon Ball is this kind of ongoing soap operatic generational approach to storytelling. So, man, of course we want to do more. We have Fico and I have planning documents of multiple sagas.
Oh,
right?
Awesome. Okay.
So what you see now, we've developed the taxonomy for it too, right? And this took much discussion. So there are issues, which is self-explanatory. What you have in that trade, that's an arc.
Right.
There are 2 arcs in a saga.
Okay.
So this saga, as you read volume 1, and it's pretty clear that this saga is not
right. Absolutely.
And there's another arc we'd love to do, and we have notes and thoughts and plans for at least 2 additional sagas after this.
So we're looking at potentially 6 volumes if things go well.
Hopefully, man. That's the dream. That's Fico and I would love to keep doing No One Left to Fight until the characters and the creative team are all old and gray. That's our dream.
That would be awesome. So that's first of all, one of the things I've doing these Coliseum forums that it's been great is creators that and you've just read their name, you actually hear their names for the first time. So Fico Asio, I've been calling him Fico, and I'm sorry, Fico. I
don't think he'd mind.
So
he's pretty easygoing guy.
Fair. So let's talk about that, because the first time I saw his work was on that Spider-Man the action at IDW that he was doing, and I was like, wow, that is a good looking Spider-Man, right? And so when you guys announced and as you guys were calling it at the time, the comic book you always wanted, and I saw he was tagged to it with you.
It's on the cover. We're still calling it that. It's on the cover.
Okay, fair. And if you haven't read it, it is the comic you always wanted, especially if you did grow up in that generation where Dragon Ball was super important to you, Dragon Ball Z. Like I said, it's like a love letter. It's not derivative. The art is amazing. But
Dragon Ball is definitely the in, and it's definitely what we use to sell it. But
sure.
We pull from a lot of, what is one of the most popular genres in the world, which is fight manga, right?
Yeah, right.
And that includes not just Dragon Ball, but One Punch Man and My Hero Academia and Naruto and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure and Baki and Kengan and Ashura and Fist of the North Star. There's a billion of these things, but and this is again one of the catalysts behind us doing this is, as popular as all that stuff is worldwide, again, generations of people love this stuff. It's not really a genre that American comics has done.
Absolutely not. And that's actually my elevator pitch when I'm talking to customers in stores like that. I'm like, this is like a fight manga, but it's done in an American comic. The art's great. The story is awesome. And typically they flip through 2 or 3 pages and they want to take it home.
That's awesome to hear, man. That's a thing that I found too, is that and I kind of learned this in doing my pitch for it, which was that, a lot of people love fight anime, but they're put off by fight manga for a bunch of reasons, right? And this isn't a value judgment, but this is just what people tell me, and it's true. Some people have a hard time doing the right to left reading thing. It's
absolutely.
It's a thing you have to learn, and it's a bigger hurdle for some people than others. That's a hurdle. It being in those manga being in black and white, especially if you're used to bright color in anime, going to black and white manga can feel like a weird step back. And it's something you have to get used to reading and learn how to read. And then the fact that you say, okay, well, I want to start reading Dragon Ball, and you go to, at a bookstore or a comic book shop or whatever, and you see that there's a full wall of these things. That's intimidating.
It is. Yes, you're not wrong. Absolutely.
Especially when each one's like $10.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, and you do the math and you realize you're gonna have to spend $300 just to read this thing. That's a lot to ask. That's a big buy-in to ask of people. So, that's a thing that we really tried to drive home and take advantage of with No One Left to Fight. Is it's a way to get those, the things that you love about fight manga and the unique things about it. Because and people who watch or have read these things, they know fight manga has a lot in common with superhero stuff, but it's very different. Right. It's a distinctly different, you could say they're both under the larger like action adventure umbrella.
Right.
But they're distinct mediums, or not mediums, genres with their own tropes and traditions and idiosyncrasies. And, we really wanted to be able to provide for American comics readers who love fight anime. We wanted to give them a comic that hit the same way.
No, that makes sense. So we kind of talked about the beginning of Comic Book Story, right? Like, so how did you and Fico get hooked up, and then how was No One Left to Fight born between you two, right? Like you guys...
So Fico and I knew each other. We were both working at IDW. I was working on G.I. Joe. Fico had worked on a bunch of stuff at IDW, right? Skylanders tie-in comics, and he drew like the big Revolution thing that like the G.I. Joe that me and Yanni Milaniani and folks worked on, like that spun out of. He did that. He'd done that and Revolutionaries and Transformers stuff, and we had done a lot of work, and it all been licensed stuff, right? Or stuff for other people. It hadn't been work that was our work, right? And again, that's not to denigrate licensed work, right? Or work for hire comics or anything like that. But we really, we felt like we had a lot more to offer, and we had juice in the we had a lot left in the tank, to do a wrestling reference. But we that's Mark Henry, by the way. We felt like we could do a lot more than what we than the tasks that had been set before us, right? Because if you're working for someone, this is a thing that Howard Chaykin told me one time, is that if you're doing work for hire or licensed comics, which are basically the same thing, if you're doing that stuff, you are a craftsman, right? Okay. You're like someone hired to make shelving units for a specific home, right? Okay. They need to be of this color wood. They need to fit within this space. They need to fit books and items of this height and size. You're making something to specifications, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, really brilliant, wonderful work can be done that way. But it's not the same as if you sit down to make something of your own. Sure. Right. And we desperately wanted to do that. That was always the dream for us. Yeah. Right. Making our own comics and, having our own ideas and pursuing those in the exact way that we wanted to do them. And so Fico and I knew that we wanted to work together. We hadn't, the stars hadn't aligned that we were working on it, that we'd ever worked on anything together at IDW. And we started talking about what we would put together on our own and what that project would be. And, Fico and I hang out annually, not this year though. Fucking tear, swearing. Sorry, I've been trying not to work blue, and I slipped up once. So fix it in post. Tear, we won't be hanging out at San Diego Comic-Con this year, but for the past 3 or 4 years, Fico and I hang out at San Diego Comic-Con every year, and because it's the one con that he comes up to from Buenos Aires, where he lives in Argentina. Okay. Yeah. And we were standing on the floor of San Diego Comic-Con a few years ago, and we heard this, we were talking about something else, and I just kept hearing this over loudspeakers. And if you've been to San Diego Comic-Con or any big comic book convention, it's just a madhouse and weird noises and smells, definitely weird smells, just wafting through this massive space all the time. And I was like, what is that? What is that screaming? Because it was starting to really annoy me. And he goes, oh, dude, you didn't see? I did it earlier. It's like a booth, and you get in it, and you can go, and they do green screen stuff and make you go Super Saiyan.
Oh, that's cool. Very cool.
Yeah, and so they had just a huge line of people
just powering up at the con.
Getting in this box and screaming, and they were putting it over PA systems so everybody could hear it. And I thought I was like, oh, that's so cool. Not cool enough for me to wait in line for an hour and a half, but very cool. Yeah. And we started talking, and we realized that we were both huge Dragon Ball fans. And that was the genesis, man. So we started talking about Dragon Ball and all the things we loved about it, and kind of it's hard to talk about because I don't ever want to sound like I'm running down Dragon Ball, but there are things that Dragon Ball was not concerned with, right?
No, agreed.
Dragon Ball was structured in a specific way. Like most manga, it was structured to fit into these weekly magazine installments. And, when that happens, when, people aren't buying your specific story, they're buying this package of stories, there are different storytelling requirements and benchmarks and hurdles than if people are buying a $4 comic book that's just your story. So, that results in a different type of narrative. And we started off talking about, all the things we love about Dragon Ball and how we could adapt that into an American style narrative that we would need to be working in, because there's nothing comparable to manga, like weekly manga magazines in the United States.
There's no Shonen Jump or anything like that.
Exactly. Yeah, that just doesn't exist here. And so, man, that was the start of it. And from there, we started kicking around ideas and like for the world and stuff like that. And one of the most fun things about No One Left to Fight is that I think that in my experience, both as a writer and an editor, a lot of comic books get created like this. The writer comes up with an idea.
Right.
They tell the artist the idea. Yep. The artist says, "Okay, great." The writer then goes off and comes up with all the characters, makes up, a lot of times comes up with visual descriptions for the characters, comes up with the story, comes up with everything, and then sends it to the artist, and then the artist makes it work. And I don't like that, because I think that that's what that's what we were just talking about in terms of licensed comics and work for hire comics. That's what that is, right? Somebody sends you a list of specifications and tells you to do a job.
Go build those shelves.
And again, great work comes out of that, but it's not what Fico and I wanted to do. We wanted to collaborate. We wanted to make something together. So, it was really a open process in terms of, I certainly came up with some visual ideas, but a lot of the ideas for the story flowed out of character designs and sketches and stuff that Fico did, right? Like, we had a general idea for our cast, and then Fico drew these characters. And then once I saw those characters, I was like, oh, okay, now I know how this fits in. And, one of the wildest things, if you're ever talking to Fico in any setting, right?
Okay.
He loves talking about it, and it's bananas to me. But like, so one of the things that's really unique about Fico's art is how detailed and how many like accoutrement people have on their gear, and just like all the different items and stuff. None of that's random. That's all stuff that Fico has thought about, and there's a reason before it. There's stories behind it.
So like Volley and his goggles and stuff, that's all has...
There's a reason for it. Yeah, man. There's reasons for absolutely everything all of those people are wearing. And Fico can tell you about it. And some of it you'll find out as you're reading No One Left to Fight, or maybe you can kind of put together. Others you'll just have to ask Fico, or we might be able to address in future sagas. But yeah, man, it was the most collaborative creative process I had ever experienced. And it's something that and doing it that way and seeing how good the results are, right? And seeing that like the end product is, as instead of being a book that is, American comics are really writer centric, right? Sometimes to their detriment, I think.
Sure.
You know what? I'll go for it. Oftentimes to their detriment, right? Because it takes it from being it. And again, it feeds into this assembly line idea of comics, where it's just you do your part and you pass it to the next guy, and then they do their part. And I think that might be the most efficient way to make a comic. I don't think it's the way to make the best comic, right? That's why Taylor's our letterer on No One Left to Fight, Taylor Esposito, and he's been a crucial part of talking about the aesthetic design and look of this thing, right? Because if you've read the book, you know that the lettering plays a big role. The lettering is a character in and of itself, especially like our big sound effects and stuff like that. And I think that if you want to do so, I think generally, there is this idea that like, the purest comic is a comic that's done by one person, right? Because they have complete, it's like auteur theory, right? They have complete control and they do everything themselves. And it's like the purest expression of their artistic vision. And I think that's true if you're comparing a comic done by one person to a comic done by like 3, 4, 5, a dozen, right? Like however many chefs in the kitchen, cooks in the kitchen. I think the way that you beat that, right, the way you get around that, and it's difficult and it takes a lot of work, but it's worthwhile, is that you find a way that everyone can contribute. and that good ideas can come from everywhere, and that you build off of and you riff off of each other instead of just doing your part and expecting the other person to follow your directions, you move away
from,
or elevate it.
From that assembly line and more towards like an actual collaboration.
An actual collaboration. Yeah, man. I mean, and so that is, I mean, I think that's like the defining element of our working process on No One Left to Fight, is that it's an actual collaboration.
That's always cool to hear, like that behind the scenes stuff that, like, you know, you guys are actually working together. This isn't you just like, you know, post it up in your, I assume you have like a study with Victorian books everywhere. And
sure, let's go with that.
That's what, yeah, that's my headcanon. And you write the script, and then, you know, you send it, you know, Western Union to Argentina, and, you know, he opens up the, you know, but no, it's really cool to hear you guys.
I love that your headcanon. Not only do I have a Victorian study, but I'm using the Telegraph.
Yeah,
to send scripts
yeah,
to
exactly.
people.
This is how you do all of your creative. Yeah, listen, I have been to Aaron's house when you guys talk, so I see this. So, no. With that said, I do have a couple of questions from some of the people watching.
Lay them on me.
So the first one, we talked about this a little bit earlier. We asked who your number one was. You said it was Ric Flair, but now we want to know who is your wrestling Mount Rushmore? Like, you're putting that together. Yeah.
Okay. So wrestling Mount Rushmore is, I consider that a different question than like wrestling top four.
Sure.
Right.
That's fair.
I think wrestling top four are my favorites.
Yep.
Wrestling Mount Rushmore, I think, should be most influential and important.
Like the legends that influenced the genre.
Yeah, man.
Yeah,
so
fair.
I'm keeping Flair.
Okay.
Flair goes up there.
Perfect.
And this is another question that I've been asked a billion times, and I always give different answers. So do not expect consistency from me. I think that Lou Thesz has to go on there as well. I think that I'm going to go with I don't know whether to do Ricky. I know I need to put either Ricky Dozen or Giant Baba on there. I'm going to go with Giant Baba because I think that even though Giant Baba was trained by Ricky Dozen, Giant Baba had more influence also as a promoter too, as a promoter of All Japan, right? And as a hugely popular wrestler. And I think that I'm going to do a somewhat unorthodox choice. I'm going to put Eddie Guerrero on there. And Eddie Guerrero is a guy who I always love. So it's Flair, Thesz, Baba, Eddie Guerrero, right?
Okay.
That's my final answer. And the reason I put Eddie Guerrero on there is Eddie Guerrero is a guy I always loved. I always thought was great. But doing the comic book story of professional wrestling, I really realized how important and influential that guy was.
Sure.
Right? He wasn't just a super talented, good wrestler. That guy, So, and I know that this isn't the be all and end all, but I was kind of shocked when it happened. That guy showed up in so many chapters of the comic book story of professional wrestling. He showed up in the Mexican chapter. He showed up in the Japanese chapter.
Right.
He showed up in the 90s chapter, and he showed up in like the kind of contemporary present day chapter. Which I don't think any other wrestler did, showed up in that many individual chapters of the book. And I think that is really indicative of how wide reaching that guy's impact was, and how he was a synthesis of three kind of distinct traditions, which is lucha libre, Japanese wrestling, and North American wrestling.
So I got another question, and it's kind of along the same lines. Probably a hard one to answer. Top 3 fight manga.
So Dragon Ball, if I can choose all of Dragon Ball,
I'll
say
do that. Akira Toriyama Dragon Ball.
If not, I'm taking Dragon Ball Z. Dude, I am a big JoJo's fan. I adore JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. That's a big one for me. And truthfully, so I haven't read the manga because it's not translated. And I'm kind of too dumb to figure out how to do like the scanlation thing. But I adore Baki anime. Baki, I'm going to go ahead and assume that I would love the manga just as much.
Right. Fair. So at this point, that's about our time. Cool, Aubrey, you've been absolutely awesome. Do you have anything coming up that you want to talk about?
You know what? Nothing's announced so far. Things are, we're kind of being hush hush. I know my editors would be furious at me if I was spilling the beans so early on things.
No, fair.
Good stuff's coming. I'm very excited about it. In the meantime, Comic Book Story Professional Wrestling, No One Left to Fight, they are available.
At Coliseum Comics.
I think, please, I don't need to belabor this point because you hear about it all day, every day. But comic book shops are having a hard time right now. Everybody's having a hard time right now.
Yes.
Retail shops especially, comic book shops especially, for idiosyncratic reasons endemic to the comic book industry that I don't have time or interest in getting into.
For sure.
But comic book shops are struggling right now. They need your support. So give your local shop a call. It varies region to region,
right,
city to city, shop to shop, what they are doing, what they can do.
Right.
But many of them, if they're not allowed to do curbside delivery, they are doing mail order. Give them a ring. See what you can do. See what Aubrey Sitterson comics they have in stock. And if they're all sold out, as I heard from a shop today that they sold their last No One Left to Fight trade. Well, buy something else.
Fair. Just
number one choice is my books. Close number two, other stuff.
Anything
Give them a
else,
ring,
right?
Buy some comics, get some reading material for this shelter at home situation we're all in.
I want to blay fears. We stock Aubrey books deep in most of our locations. Yeah, if you guys are interested in No One Left to Fight, comic book story, professional wrestling,
give Billy a call. Give
right.
Billy specifically.
Me personally, I'll be posting my cell phone number here shortly. You guys text whatever you need to do. But Aubrey, man, you were awesome. Thank you so much,
brother. Thanks for having me.
I think real quick, you are one of my favorite people in comics. Not only because you do really cool comics that I like to read, but your excitement for comics and the comics industry that is unfortunately in some cases unique. And so I think you have a really great
brother.
energy, man.
I really appreciate that. It's something I take really seriously because, in my opinion, the reason I create things, right? The reason I because I consider writing an art, right? Like the reason I do art is to share it with people, right? Like it's meant to be read and it's meant to be enjoyed. And if I make something that I'm not excited about, I know that I need to go back in and give it another editing pass.
Right.
I know that I need to fix it. Right. And if you're making things that you're not excited about, I don't know why you would be wasting your time with such a thing. So for me, it's just natural. And there are few things I like more than talking about things that I'm proud of and am excited to have created. So no, man, this is a joy, and talking to readers and retailers and fans is a treat for me. So thank you for giving me an opportunity to do it.
Again, Aubrey, thanks so much for stopping by today. Guys, thanks for joining us for Coliseum Forum, and stay safe.